Hello everyone, welcome to this discussion on Unit 4 of Paper 1 and Subunit 1, which is Karl Marx. So as you know, the fourth unit is to do with sociological thinkers, and in this particular lecture video, we are going to quickly look into Karl Marx, the first subunit of thinkers, and through the PYQs, we will try and understand the overall UPSC bent and prepare for possible questions in relation to the four broad topics that are there in Karl Marx. Now, for Marx, before we go into the details, just one or two pointers that can always rescue you if you run out of ideas. So one of the things that could always be pointed out is that Marx happens to be one of the key founders, one of the main founders of the sociological tradition. We can also think about Marx as somebody who provided an alternative to existing conventional sociological theory. There is also a certain misconception, or shall we say there is lack of understanding in relation to Marx's overall theory or overall theoretical formulation. And Marx's theory is not simply about how society is, but it is about how the society can be turned into a more equal, a more just, a more humanitarian, a more liberal society, right? Now, with this, we move on to the first subunit of Marx, which is historical materialism. Now, the first thing that I want to point out in relation to historical materialism is that Marx basically did not use this particular phrase. The phrase that he used is materialist conception of history. So the phrase that is used is materialist conception of history. This is an interesting, right? And the source is the book, The German Ideology. So it was in the German Ideology that Marx propounds the thesis, historical materialism, for the first time. So just two things, the German Ideology as the source text here, that's a value addition. And of course, we use historical materialism, but the phrase that Marx has used in German Ideology is materialist conception of history. Now, this is a very, very important cornerstone block of sociological theory, Marxism. So let's look at the PYQs. Now, in relation to the PYQs, I've just looked at three recent ones, particularly looking at historical materialism. So as I pointed out, that for the first time, it was articulated in the German Ideology. The German Ideology is a book that came out in 1845, 1846. So that's the time span. And I already pointed out that the phrase that Marx uses is materialist conception of history. Now, Marx writes in the German Ideology, and I'm going to straight away quote, right? And this is a quote that you can always remember, paraphrase, memorize, etc. And Marx says, before anything else, that's the quote, before anything else, human beings must satisfy their everyday economic needs. Before anything else, human beings must satisfy their everyday economic needs through their physical labor and practical productive activity. And he says, this is the starting point of materialism, right? So that's what we have. If you look at the questions, is what is historical materialism? Straightforward. Examine its relevance in understanding contemporary societies. Okay. Analyze Marxian conception of historical materialism as a critique of Hegelian dialectics. So we'll have to go into that. Analyze the salient features of historical materialism. So rather straightforward. The only question that requires a bit of work on our part is the one wherein we have to compare it with the Hegelian theory of dialectics. Now let's first figure out what materialism is, historical materialism, materialist conception of history, and then we go on to discuss Hegelian dialectics. So I have already shared with you how Marx puts on record his thesis on materialism, that before anything else, human beings must take care of their everyday economic needs through their own physical labor and practical productive activity. So that's the starting point of materialism. Now, it is called historical materialism, but it is materialist conception of history. I have already shared with you. It is the cornerstone of Marx's social and political thinking. We already know this. Now, what Marx does is basically, before Marx, the thesis, so this is materialism, and that is something that Marx takes up. But before Marx, it was idealism. So basically, idealism was about primacy of ideas. And this is to be traced back to George Wilhelm Hegel. So Hegel also talks about dialectics, but his dialectics is in the realm of ideas, whereas the Marxian dialectics, so thesis, antithesis, synthesis, the Marxian dialectics is in the realm of material needs, whereas the Hegelian dialectics is in the realm of ideas. Now, Hegel points out that it is consciousness that determines being. So basically, ideas are prime movers of history. It's almost like the philosophy of history argument. If you remember the Unit 1 discussion, T.B. Baltimore, intellectual factors, philosophy of history. So basically, ideas as prime movers. It's a very typical Enlightenment argument. But Marx points out that guess what? It is not consciousness that determines being, but it is being that determines consciousness. If you check out some PYQ, some of the older previous year questions, you have this phrase. It is not consciousness that determines being, but it is being that determines consciousness. Now, this is simply a shift from the Hegelian dialectics. So the Hegelian dialectics is consciousness determines being, meaning ideas are more important than material needs. The Marxian position is, which is what we call, he turned it on its heel, he inverted the entire thing. The Marxian position is, it is being that determines consciousness. So Hegel was talking about ideas. The dialectics, this tension, conflict, struggle is in the realm of ideas. There is one idea and there is a counter idea, and then there is a conflict, and then this leads to synthesis. There is another idea that comes to the fore. But Marx, as I said, he does not agree with it. So now, in relation to historical materialism, just a few important value addition. Now, Anthony Giddens has also defined historical materialism. He says, historical materialism is primarily concerned, the thesis, the theory of historical materialism is primarily concerned with how people work collectively, how they work collectively to produce a life together. So that's as simple as that. How people work collectively to produce a life together. How do they produce food, shelter, and other material goods? And what kind of division of labor exists which enables them to do so, right? So that's Anthony Giddens. So you can always keep a note of this. Basically, what Marx is trying to point out through his theory of historical materialism or materialist conception of history is that the way in which people provide for their material needs determines, or in some senses, determines in general, or we could say in some senses, it tells us about the conditions, the relations that people have with each other, right? So the kind of production activity that we have will determine the kind of relations that people have with each other. Not just their relations, but their institutions, their ideas, etc. So this is something that Marx talks about, that everything else is secondary. Material needs are the most important, the prime most vital stuff about human societies. So there are three core premises of historical materialism. What are the three core premises? The first premise of historical materialism is, before anything else, human beings must be in a position to obtain food, shelter, and clothing. So basically, three basic primary needs. Before anything else, these are the three things they must be in a position to obtain. So that's point number one. So the first act, historical act, is the act of production. Right? Before anything else, man must get into production, and for food, for shelter, for clothing. That's the first premise. The second premise of historical materialism is that the moment a human being, the moment man or human being enters into production, the man is able to distinguish himself from the animal, right? So the moment you produce, because animals do not produce, animals of course consume, and they have their own strategies of consumption, they store, but production, Marx says that production is something that distinguishes human beings from animals. So the moment you produce, you are distinguishing yourself from the animals. So animals simply find in nature what they want. Human beings actually must produce, right? So there's a difference between the animal world and the human world. And the third premise is that the way in which human beings depend, or the way in which a human being, or the way in which human beings produce, depends on what they find in nature. So for example, let's say 2000 years ago, 3000 years ago, 5000 years ago, the way in which they were producing, of course, had to do with whatever they found around themselves. And if you look at contemporary society, the way in which we produce as a human society has to do with whatever we find ourselves surrounded by. So the way in which we find ourselves in nature, that's the way in which we produce. So basically, what Marx is trying to point out is that every stage in human civilization has a different way of producing, has a different mode of production. Now, in this context of historical materialism, it's an elaborate thing. So Marx then, in the context of historical materialism, there are four components. There are four components. What are these four components? So for example, you begin with means of production. Now this is fairly simple, means of production, as the phrase itself is self-explanatory. Marx begins by asserting that in every stage of history, human beings have had at their disposal certain productive forces of land, animals, tools, and machinery, and these which are necessary to produce, and these are called means of production, right? So necessary for things which are required for production. So that's means of production. Now, means of production basically has to do with the external world, which is used to obtain livelihoods, which is used to produce income, and so on and so forth. So it can be defined as anything in the outside world which is utilized to produce food, shelter, and clothing. That's your means of production. Now, with means of production, and he also remarked that what happens historically in societies is that means of production are not equally distributed, or they are not proportionately distributed in the society. Historically, what we have found out, Marx says, and this is again his theory of historical materialism, historically what we have found out is that the means of production invariably are owned predominantly by one class, and then there is another class that does not own it. So on that basis, he defines one class as haves and the other class as have-nots. So this is the single most defining aspect of materialist theory of history, or the materialist conception of history, or historical materialism, which is to do with the condition of ownership of means of production. That there is always one class that owns, and there is another class that does not own. And historically, we have seen this across modes of production. So that's Marxian positions. It's a very, very important proposition that he has for us, that we must understand means of production are never, ever judiciously, proportionately distributed, or they are not collectively owned, right? In the societies we live in, there is a class, which is the powerful capitalist haves, they own, and then there is another class, which is laborers, workers, etc. They do not own. So you have the haves and you have the have-nots. You have the capitalists and you have the workers. Now, there is, the moment you're talking about this ownership thing in the context of means of production, the moment you say there is one class that owns and there is another class that does not own, there are two things that straight away happen as a result of that. The first thing that happens is that those who own the means of production, meaning the powerful class, right, the capitalists, the feudal lords, whatever, the masters, they basically begin to monopolize it as some sort of a private property. So it is turned into their own private property. And as a result of that, they just control over it. Now, once they monopolize it, once they have a certain monopoly over it, then what they do is they use the means of production as per their own whims and fancies. So this is the next thing that happens, right? So they will determine how the means of production are to be used in the society. Now, when the means of production fall into private hands, workers no longer employ the means of production freely on their own. And this leads to alienation, but that is something that we are going to discuss later. So the first is means of production. Then he talks about relations of production. Now, relations of production again is a very important component. Now, these are of central importance, or we say these are exceedingly vital, crucial. How's that? Because it is the relations of production which economically bind one class to another in the production process. Relations of production. One class, so the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. This is something that is very, very central, and that's to do with relations of production. Production is not an individual exercise, it's a social act. So different people come together, and because means of production already are owned and means of production are not owned, there is a specific kind of relations of production that we have. There is one class that does not own the means of production. There is another class that owns it, uses it in a very, very monopolistic way. Now, this is something that contributes to a specific kind of relations of production in capitalism. So when he is talking about the word relations, it is important to remember that he is trying to indicate the connection between the way a society produces and the social roles allotted to individuals in the production process. So the way in which a society produces, if the society produces in a way that means of production are collectively owned, then of course it's very different. Then social roles that are allocated to different individuals remain the same. But if the means of production are owned by one class and the means of production are not owned by the majority, then of course these relations of production suggest that different individuals will have different social roles. Relations of production also relates to maintenance of social domination. So relations do not mean just people related. This is about domination. This is about extraction of an economic surplus, meaning the workers will be compelled to, they will be pushed to, they will be forced to work for much longer hours. They will be compelled to put in much more effort and labor than they are supposed to. So there is an extraction of economic surplus and there is exploitation of labor. So the moment we are talking about relations of production, we are looking at relations of domination, or we are looking at maintenance of social domination, we are looking at extraction of economic surplus, and we are looking at exploitation of labor. So these are some of the things that we have in relation to relations of production. There are three core features of relations of production. Basically, relations of production indicate, or they inform us how the productive forces, how the productive roles are actually structured. So that is point number one. Relations of production govern the way the worker uses the means of production. So what kind of relations of production exist? That will determine how, as a worker, I make use of the means of production to satisfy my material needs. And third, Marx says relations of production appear in all societies. So that's specifically about relations of production. Another important pointer about relations of production, as in two important aspects that we just cannot simply afford to miss out on, is that the non-owners, who are the non-owners? The workers, the proletariats. The non-owners are compelled into the relations of production. So they don't really enter into it willingly, right? Voluntarily, conscientiously. No, they are compelled to enter into relations of production in order to satisfy their material and economic needs. The workers have no other option. They have simply no other option but to enter into it, right? So they enter into it, and the moment they enter into it, as a result, what happens is they are immediately, instantly subordinated. They are subordinated by the class that is the dominant class. So they are subordinated they are subordinated to the bourgeoisie. So that's the first aspect, that the non-owners of means of production do not enter into relations of production willingly. They have no other option but to enter into it. The moment they enter, they become subordinate. The second is that because workers tend to be subordinate to these owners or these bosses, they are compelled to labor both for themselves, because they have to take care of their own economic material needs. So they are compelled to labor for themselves, for their own livelihoods, as well as for their bosses, in terms of the economic value that is derived from the production process. So the moment they enter into it, they do not only labor for themselves, they also labor for their bosses, they also labor for the owners. The third pointer, so this is the first, this is the second. The third one is mode of production. Now, this is a broader reference, mode of production. Now, mode of production simply is the way people actually produce and enter into social relations with one another is called mode of production. This is the larger landscape of production, and this comprises the total way of life of society. So the mode of production is the ultimate category. Within the mode of production, you have means of production, relations of production, etc. So basically, when as societies gradually evolve, human beings, as they move from one stage to another, they also change their mode of production. So if you look at our own history, and Marx talks about this, from primitive communism to slavery to feudalism to capitalism, these are different ways in which people were producing. So at every stage, societies indulged in one way of producing, one mode of producing, and that he called mode of production. So we have to, and in order to again gain more clarity on what is mode of production, we also have to make a distinction between forces of production, so which is the fourth point. There is also something called forces of production. So basically, mode of production, forces of production is something that usually people confuse with means of production. But forces of production and means of production are not the same. The forces of production express the degree to which human beings control nature. So if you go back to primitive communism, the control that human beings had on nature was very little. And if you go from primitive communism to slavery, the control goes up. You go from slavery to feudalism, the control even goes further up. And you come to capitalism, now I think everyone is under human beings' control. So the degree to which human beings control nature actually is something that we get to know through forces of production. So the forces of production are the ways in which material goods are produced. Now they include the technological know-how. So forces of production would be technological knowledge, technological know-how, skills, types of equipment in use, and goods being produced, for example, tools, machinery, labor, etc. So basically, forces of production is means of production plus labor power, right? So you have means of production and you add labor power to means of production, this becomes forces of production. You have forces of production and you have relations of production, you bring them two together, that becomes your mode of production. So the relations of production are always about how the forces of production are to be used in order to produce, right? So this is something, sorry. So the relations of production are always about how the forces of production are to be used in order to produce. So this is how, and Marx talked about 4 modes of production. You already know this: Asiatic, then he talks about ancient, which is slavery, then feudal, and then capitalism or capitalist mode of production. And then there is just a quick pointer in relation to core features of capitalistic mode of production, just in case there's a short note. core features, essential features, salient features of capitalistic mode of production. So T.B. Baltimore points out that there are a few core characteristics of capitalism or capitalistic mode of production. Number one, goods are produced for sale rather than own use. So sale is always more important than self-use and so on. Then number two, the capacity to do useful work or the capacity for labor power is bought and sold in the market. So in capitalism, labor power is bought and sold in the market. So laborers in capitalism, laborers are not obliged or forced to surrender their labor. So they're never forced. Instead, they enter into a contract with employers. So in capitalism, labor is free. But at the same time, the situation is such that laborers have no other option but to enter into a contract. And then the moment they enter into this contract, of course, things get very, very tricky for them because there is domination, exploitation, etc. So one can also look into this again, contemporary societies, in terms of how the relations of production still remain very, very problematic. Then the use of money as a medium of exchange. This is also very important in capitalism. Earlier we had exchange of services, we had returns in kind, but money's entry has been very, very central to capitalist enterprise because with money you have banks, you have financial institutions, intermediaries, etc. And lastly, the production process is controlled by the capitalists or their managers, and the financial decisions are controlled by the capitalist entrepreneur. So these are some of the things that Baltimore refers to as very core, vis-a-vis, very central to the overall capitalistic mode of production. Now, historical materialism has, if you're looking at historical materialism's criticism, because we have to also look at its relevance. Now, there are different pointers in relation to criticism, but there are a few that have been talked about. So one is called the development thesis, which essentially is that in any case, individuals, they are motivated to improve their material situation under conditions of scarcity, and there is no reason to imagine that this individual motivation is universally all about an interest in the development of forces of production. So basically the point is that individuals will work towards their development, towards their prosperity, and we can't really certify. So historical materialism says this is all about development of the forces of production, but criticism is saying we cannot be certain whether in every act the individual in which the individual is trying to gain prosperity, attain material advantages, etc. We can't really say whether every act is actually about development of or development vis-a-vis the forces of production. Then this economic reductionism is also something that is repeatedly questioned. So basically, historical materialism tells us that economy is the pivotal plank, it is the ultimate reference. But economic determinism, I'm sure some of you already know this, but especially with reference to this base superstructure thing, that superstructure is always determined by the base, etc. This is all considered as absolutely illegitimate because scholars, critics have pointed out that the world is much more complex and different societies actually swear by different logic of inequality, exploitation, and discrimination. For example, if you think about feminists are very clear that class is not necessarily something that is the basis of exploitation. There is gender. If you think about Dalits, Dalits are also very clear that it is not class but caste. If you think about race, people of color have experienced all kinds of nasty things because of the color and not necessarily of the class, etc. Then there is also problem in terms of transformation. So although historical materialism says till capitalism things have gotten worse, and from capitalism, of course in capitalism they will get worst possible, there will be the worst possible scenario, and after that things will be fantastic because there will be a classless society, etc. But this transformation thesis is also something that scholars have not really found very convincing, because they say there is absolutely no reason to suppose that there will emerge any historical agents capable of transforming the relations of production. One just does not get it that how suddenly relations of production will be transformed. Then historical materialism is unfalsifiable. Karl Popper points this out. He says that because it is unfalsifiable, it cannot be given, offered the status of science. So he says this is not scientific. He calls it pseudo-scientific in his work Conjectures and Refutations. So Karl Popper calls it pseudo-scientific. And it is also pointed out that historical materialism is basically an exaggerated claim. It is well known that social, cultural, and ideological superstructure of society are not under complete control of the base. So basically, it exaggerates things quite a bit, historical materialism as a thesis. Now, there are a few things, of course, that capitalism has caused: the feeling of meaninglessness, a series of booms and depressions, which also leads to a lot of problems in society. Civil society is becoming more and more civil society is becoming less and less consequential in terms of being able to solve social problems, because the market has become so powerful. The state is growing, but the state actually, in most of the countries of the world, the state invariably is found protecting the interests of the capitalists' private property. And basically, it is pointed out that because of capitalism, what has happened is that the lives we could live, right? The lives we could live and the lives we do live, there is a growing distance. The gulf between the two is ever widening, right? The lives we could live and the gap between the kinds of lives we could live because of our productiveness, our creativity, our potential, our capability, and the lives we do live, as in what's going on because of the capitalist organization. This is, of course, something that majorly concerns many of us. So these are some of the criticisms of historical materialism. Let's move on. Mode of production we have already done, because critically examine the dialectics involved in each mode of production. So this is, again, we'll have to get into the slave master, we'll have to get into the serf and the landlord, and we'll have to get into the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Evaluate Marx's ideas on mode of production. This is the 10 marker. So this we have already done, because when we were doing historical materialism, we at length sort of got into mode of production. So